Hello my quilting friends! My name is Leah Day and welcome to this long arm quilting tutorial. I want to quilt a new quilt on my Grace Unique machine and this continuum frame, so I need to load this up so it's ready to go. So in this video I'm going to show you all the steps to loading a quilt on the frame, getting all the layers smoothed out, and this is basically basting your quilt, but instead of having to spread it out on the floor or spread it out over a table and spend a lot of time working with that backing fabric and smoothing everything out, you load it on the long arm frame and it speeds up the process tremendously. And this is the main reason, I'll be completely honest, that I really wanted to switch to a quilting frame, because I just reached a point where I was just so tired of the basting process when quilting on my home machine. So this is the process that I take for all of the quilts whenever I'm getting started working on the Grace Unique. So the quilt that I'm going to be working on, this is actually one of my unfinished projects, so it's also helping me achieve the goal of quilting my quilts and getting a lot more finished this year. This is the double stripe diamond quilt, and you can find this free quilt pattern at leahday.com/stripe. So if you'd like to make this too and follow along, you absolutely can. Come and download the free quilt pattern and make this quilt with me. So in the piecing process, I always starch my fabric before cutting. So the quilt top, the finished quilt top, still feels nice and stiff and stable. And I've just folded it up and kind of kept it in a drawer this length of time while it's been unfinished. So this is really perfectly fine state. I don't usually do anything to my quilt tops before quilting them, before basting or quilting. So I'm just going to fold this up and set it aside, because the first step is to work with our backing fabric. So now let's talk about your backing fabric. And so this is what you're going to get started with whenever you are basting your quilt on the long arm, or whenever you're installing your quilt on the long arm. So I take my backing fabric and I fold it in half to create a little crease here. And I'm going to line that up with the center of my leader cloth. Okay, so leader cloth is this specialty, slightly thicker cloth, and this actually comes with the Grace Continuum frames. So it comes with it, and what you want to do is install the leader cloth on the frame and mark the center point. And you can line that up. There's a center mark where your rails come together in the middle. That's your center point, and then you can carry that down to the end of your leader cloth. So line up the center mark on your backing fabric with the center mark on that leader cloth, and then place a pen. And the pens that I'm using are slightly thicker and longer than like the normal pens that I would use for patchwork, and they're meaty. This is the only thing holding the quilt to the frame, and it does hold it under tension. So I like to use a nice thicker pen for this job. And another thing, I am a little bit fastidious about this, and I'm going to emphasize it. A pen in the middle first, and then I'm going to pin straight to the right with all of the pins pointing to the right. And I'm also pinning so that the head of one pin is hitting the point of the one before it. And because you really want to think of these pins being placed almost like stitches, they are really needing to lock the quilt into place. And the reason why I'm pinning it all in one direction is so I don't get stuck by the pins. And I got stuck a few times, and I've already bled on this leader cloth. So everything that I do is with an aim to not get stuck by the pins. So once I finish pinning all the way to one side, then I'll start back in the middle and work to the opposite side. So one thing that I kind of glossed over is which direction to install your quilt in. And this is a choice, actually. And especially for a smaller quilt, you have a choice whether to set it up on your frame so that the long side of your quilt runs with the frame, or the short side of your quilt runs with the frame. And let me grab a picture here of the quilt just to emphasize this. So this is the double stripe diamond quilt, and how I'm installing it in the frame is this way, so that as I quilt it, it's going to advance through the frame. I'm going to roll it up onto the rollers just like this. And what this means is, as I'm quilting, I can quilt a whole long section of it in one go. If let's say it was longer, I wouldn't be able to do that because really this is almost maxing out the length of my 8-foot frame here. If it was longer, then I'd have to go this way and the quilt would be rolled up. And you could see I could still quilt a good chunk of it, but I would have to advance it so many more times through the frame. You know, every time basically I'd stitch across, I need to advance the quilt again. So keep this in mind as you're installing your quilts and planning your quilts to put on a frame, whether you want to quilt them horizontally or vertically. If you wanted to do, like, you know, let's say something really simple, straight lines right across it. Well, obviously you'd want to install the quilt like this so it rolls onto the frame in this direction, so that way you can stitch those straight lines all the way across really, really quickly and get it done fast. So there we go. So that's my plan here. Kind of went over how I'm penning the backing fabric to this first take-up rail, and then I'll meet you back here whenever it's all pinned in place and we're ready to move to the next step. So as you can see, I've got my backing pinned up to this top leader, and that's ready to roll on. But before I do that, I want to cut my quilt batting. So this is Quilter's Dream polyester batting. I really like it because it's nice and thin, needle punched, and this is the select thickness, and this quilt's going to be used as a tablecloth. So I think this is going to be a really good choice. So I always buy king size batting and then spread it out and cut it down to the size that I need. And that's just about an inch or two shorter than the backing fabric. So I've got this spread out nicely here, and I just grab really big honking pair of scissors. These are Dad's, and I'll just snip this off and try and cut it as straight as I can. So that's where I'm going to cut it. I'll move it here. And obviously you don't want to cut through your backing fabric. You want to just cut through that batting. And by making the batting, you know, bigger basically than your quilt, and making sure that the backing fabric is bigger than your quilt, it's just making sure that, you know, the quilt top has more than enough room to spread out and you're not going to cut it too close. So there we go. That's how I trim that down and get it the right size. And I can save this and do lots of other projects. This is a good baby quilt size. I really think it saves money to go ahead and go with the biggest size of batting and get a king and then cut that down. You're going to end up with lots of leftover bits no matter what size of batting that you go with. So that just is my process. That's just what I end up using. Okay, so that's cut down at least the right width. Now we need to go for length. So I'm going to unfold it. There's quite a lot here. So I'm going to take a second here to just spread this out, let it drape all the way down to the floor, and that way I can cut it off along the length to make sure that I have it just exactly the right size. So now that my batting is cut to size, I'm going to set this aside. So just pull it back off again. And, you know, if that seems a little cumbersome or clunky to you and you don't like the idea of cutting your batting on the frame, where you could cut, you know, accidentally, obviously nick your leader cloths, you could nick the backing, you could do that on a table. This is just, you know, it's still a learning process for me to figure out the best system. And that's been working so far. I have gotten a little in trouble a few times, I will admit, not preparing that at this stage, not having the batting cut at this stage, and I've accidentally cut not enough batting for a quilt once. That was a little bit of a disaster. Thankfully, it was just like a practice project, so it wasn't that big of a deal. Okay, so now it's time to start rolling the quilt up, and I've got these little ratchet things on the side, so I'll make sure to close my ratchets, and you can hear them as I start to roll the quilt onto this bar. So this is your take-up bar, and what you want to do is just be careful until those pins are kind of sealed up in the fabric. You want to be real careful when you're running your hands back and forth along this. You don't want to run your hand, and obviously my pins were pointing this way. I don't want to run my hand right into them because that will really hurt. You know, those heavy-duty pins, they can pack a punch, really. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind is as you're rolling up, just to keep some tension on this, and you want to keep it even. So you can see how this side was looking just a little bit loose, and it was kind of pulling up just and rolling around just a little bit more than the other side. So keep a little bit of tension on this, and maybe even pull it down around the front bar, so that way it rolls up nice and even. In fact, actually, I think I'm going to unroll and re-roll this. If ever you feel like things just aren't going right, start all over again. It takes a minute, but that minute can make a big difference. Now these leaders are being held onto the frame with a very heavy duty piece of Velcro, but still if you put too much tension on it, obviously that Velcro can start to pull off too. So just watch out for that. And see now, this looks much better. I've got a lot more tension on that. It's nice and smooth. The bar itself was just feeling kind of squishy, and I didn't like that. So that's why I unrolled and re-rolled. Okay, so now as I'm rolling up, one thing I'm looking over here on the edges to make sure that the fabric is stacking up on top of itself. That means that the sides of the backing fabric are going on nice and straight. So just keep an eye on that. If you see that the fabric's maybe slipping inside, kind of run your hand down the length of the rail just to encourage it to stack up nicely. There we go. And keep on rolling. And you don't need to roll up the entire quilt because the next step is to pin and roll the opposite end of the quilt onto this next roll right here. So we basically take the backing and attach it to the take-up rail, which is the back rail, and then the front rail here, we're going to pin to the other side. And this is the exact same process as before. I'm going to fold the backing fabric in half and find a midpoint. And then start in the middle where I've marked the leader cloth and pin from that midpoint to one side and then pin to the other side, working carefully and pinning the exact same way, with the exact same heavy-duty pins, so that way the backing fabric is locked really nicely and securely in place. So this time I'll take this leader cloth, and you can see this is a much longer leader cloth than the other one. And that's intentional because that allows you, as the quilt is being advanced, you have more space there. So here we go. Grab my pins again. And this time, as you can see, I'm lining up, putting that fabric edge right up against the edge of the leader cloth and pinning right on that dotted line. There we go. And again, I want to make sure all of the pins are going in one direction, and whichever way it feels natural for you. I'm left-handed, so I like to insert my pins so that the points are pointing to the right. That just feels natural for me. More than likely, if you're right-handed, you will flip that. And this is just a habit that I've gotten into, even in just this short space of time working on the long arm, just to reduce the chance of poking myself with the pens, because it really does hurt, and then you bleed all over the place, and it just, it makes the day no fun. So from here, I'm going to pin on this line of pins and make sure that the backing fabric is completely attached to this leader cloth, and I'll meet you back here when we're ready to layer on the batting and the quilt top. So I have my backing fabric completely pinned on both sides, and now I'm going to start rolling this up onto this side. So just like before, I like to run my hands back and forth along the leader cloth, being careful whenever I reach the point that the pins start. And the reason why I want to make sure that this leader cloth is going on nice and smooth is because if this is real wobbly, or there isn't a lot of tension on it, it's real squishy, then the quilt's really not going to roll up all that well. So now is the time that I'm kind of careful because I've got those pins right on top, so I want to seal those up pretty quick here. Smooth this out, and then now as the quilt starts to stack up, the backing starts to stack up on top of itself, you can kind of keep an eye on these edges and make sure that that fabric stays nicely stacked on top of itself. And that, again, ensures that the backing is going straight onto the frame. It's evenly loaded. And it also, running your hands on both sides, Just ensures there's no wrinkles. You can also pull off any bits of lint or fluff. You know, especially if your quilt top is a light top like mine, you're going to want to make sure that there's no little bits of lint that are going to show through underneath it. So be watching out for that. Obviously this is the backing, so it doesn't matter quite so much on this side, but I still like to just keep it clean. Okay, so I've got the ratchets open completely so that as I'm pulling on this bar, it's unrolling from my take-up bar. And if you want to add, just have your ratchets going so that way it's taking up and it has a little tension on it, then that's good too. I'm getting just a little bit off on this side, so I'm just going to smooth that out. There we go. This is looking good. Now I'm going to pull this down to about this level because the back of my machine will go about to there. I want to bring it up just a little bit. So that looks good right there. That's where we're going to get started and attach the backing fabric. So I closed my ratchet so that way it's locked. And then I'll just give this a little tighten. So it's springy, but it's not so tight that it's really, really bouncy. Okay. And you just kind of, that's a feeling thing. You know, as you quilt more quilts, you'll get the hang of that and just kind of get the feel for where that needs to go. Okay, now I've got my batting. I'm going to fold this in half, just like before. Find the midpoint and line up that midpoint with the center line of the quilt, and that's marked on the leaders. So that looks good. I'm just going to smooth this out going in one direction, then open it up and go in the other direction. There we go. And you do generally want your batting to go on nice and straight too, although it's a little bit harder to control. It's kind of harder to figure out if you're straight and square. I mean, the best thing to do is just kind of even it up more or less in the middle of the frame. That looks good. So taking a minute to spread and smooth out my batting just over the surface of this backing fabric. And now I want to stitch a nice straight line across this. So far I haven't had my machine on at all. So this is really the first time that I turn on my machine during the quilting process. I'm going to reach back here and click it on. And why do I want to stitch a line on this? Because I've just got batting and backing here. Well, I know that the backing fabric is nice and straight to the frame. It's parallel, it's straight to the leader, all that is good. And I want the quilt to be nice and straight to the frame too. If I put it on here and it's kind of running at an angle, I might run off the edge of my batting and backing fabric, you know? I want it to be nice and straight across so I'm sure it's going to fit. So the way we do that is to stitch a nice straight line right across the frame, and I'm going to do that using a little tool called channel locks. It's actually a little feature on the machine, and I kind of like, this looks like a good place to start. So I'm kind of coming in about maybe an inch off the batting just to make sure that I have batting all the way to this edge. In fact, actually I need to come down just a little bit more. That looks good. And so the channel locks are just a little lever here on that wheel, and that locks the machine. So here I can wiggle it just a little bit, but I really can't move forward and back. I can only move side to side here. Now I've got white isocord thread threaded up in the machine, and I'm going to hit my up and down button and bring my thread up to the surface so that way I can hang on to it. And this line of stitching is actually not going to end up in the finished quilt. This is going to be off the edge of the quilt. So you can really stitch this with whatever you've got in your machine at the time. It really doesn't matter. So now I'm just going to stitch across, and I'm watching out for, you know, anything weird happening if the batting starts to lump up or anything like that. But really, I took my time smoothing this out, so it's looking really good. And you don't want to stitch too fast. And I have noticed that, you know, every once in a while my thread might decide to do something weird. In fact, actually, it just hopped out of a guide there. So I want to pop it back in that guide so it's behaving well and get started again. There we go. That's probably going to work a lot better. Sometimes your thread will just break whenever it pops out of a guide. Sometimes you'll just have really bad tension. Yeah, I can feel it. But honestly, totally does not matter because, like I said, this line of stitching is off the edge of the quilt. It's going to get cut off or covered up in the binding once the quilt is completely complete, so it totally doesn't matter. So I'm going to stitch all the way across, and then I'll be ready to attach my quilt. So at this stage, you might be wondering what we're going to do with this batting, because it's just draped over the front of the frame at this stage. And I just take it and squish it between the two rails. So there's an upper front rail, and then there's a lower rail. And I just squish it between those two rails. And I find that, fabric and fiber like to stick to each other. And generally, that's all I need to do with that batting. It just drapes to the back and it stays out of my way. And it kind of sticks a little bit to that lower rail a bit. And that's all I do with that. And now it's time to grab the quilt top. Okay, so we're going to spread this out here. And again, you want to find that midpoint. Pretty much the main thing, if you want to take anything away from this video, it's just how simple loading is. It always involves finding the midpoint to all of your pieces. Whether it's the batting, the backing, or the quilt top, you're always going to want to know where that midpoint is on both sides of whatever you're loading up. Okay, so I've got my midpoint marked here. And I'm going to line that up again with that line marked on the center of the leader. And now I'm just going to spread out the quilt over the surface. It feels like I could use just a little bit more tension on my backing. So I just gave it one little click. Now just smooth this out. And what I'm doing is I'm lining up the edge of the quilt with that line I just stitched using my channel locks. And what that ensures is that the quilt is lined up with that nice straight line, which runs parallel with the frame. And that means that the quilt's going to go in and be parallel with the frame, nice and straight and square to the frame too. So this is a stage to kind of be a little picky about your quilt. Definitely a white quilt like this, you want to make sure that there's no lint or anything that's being trapped between the batting and the white quilt top. You want to double check that. And just generally get everything nice and smooth and flat. So now I'm going to open up my channel locks, unlock it basically, and now move the machine so that I am about 1/4 inch inside the edge. Now it's just basically right on that edge. And what I'm doing there is just making sure that the stitching I'm going to do here is going to be within the area that is going to be bound, that will be trimmed and bound when the quilt is finished, because I don't really want this stitching to show. This is again just locking the quilt to the frame, making sure everything's lined up, and then I'm planning on switching to hot pink thread anyway, so I'll make sure to do that for once I actually start quilting. So once I am happy with my placement, I pull my thread up to the surface, I make sure to lock that channel lock again, so that way I am stitching nice straight line across. And then this time I'm actually going to do a little bit more wiggling of the quilt just as I stitch along that edge, making sure that I'm not overshooting that line before. I'm keeping that edge nicely lined up with the edge of that stitching. So I'm keeping the edge of the quilt lined up with the stitching from before. And as you can see, this is just a little slower, but it's not nearly as slow as basting a quilt on a table. I gotta say, this definitely has advantages. And I have taken quilts that I basted on a table and quilted part of it on a home machine and then moved it to the long arm. The process was very similar, just a matter of penning the backing fabric, making sure it goes on nice and straight, and then smoothing out everything as you go. So you can move a quilt from a home machine to a long arm and then back again. You could take a quilt off the long arm and go back to your home machine. And you can also baste. If you would like to do long arm basting, you can rent time in a local area. If there is a long arm, like a quilt shop that offers that, then you could baste your quilts this method using water soluble thread. Okay, so as you can see, things got just a little bit off here, so I'm just spreading and smoothing things out. And this is another thing that I have noticed, and that is working on a long arm, everything is very much emphasized. The straightness of your quilt, the squareness of your quilt, the accuracy of your piecing, all of that is very emphasized. So if you start to notice, like weird bubbly kind of things, excess fabric, that can be a sign that you've had a little bit of a struggle with your piecing, and that you might want to check in on your piecing skills and just, kind of pay more attention to how things are going together. Any kind of force quilting, where you kind of squished one thing right up against another thing, it can create just a little bit of distortion, and that's something that will become very apparent when you're using a long arm. That might not be nearly as apparent when you're basting on a table and quilting on a home machine. Okay, so I'm just going to keep stitching this down, and that's going to pretty much wrap up how I load my quilts on the long arm. This is the process that I take for pretty much any quilt, and as you can see, this is a pretty big one. This is maxing out my frame. The quilt top is only about 5 inches from the edge of the leader cloth, so this is probably about the biggest size quilt that I can fit on this frame comfortably. So I'm going to finish this up, and I'll show you what I do with the quilt top just to finish it up. So at this stage, you really have 2 choices when it comes to what to do with your quilt. You have a 3rd rail, and it has a nice long leader cloth. Here, I'll unlock, and you can see if I pull this out, it has a nice long leader cloth, and you can do the exact same thing that you've done before. Fold the quilt top in half along that bottom edge and pin it nice and straight to the edge of this leader cloth. And I'll admit, I did that several times. I did it the right way several times. And then I got a little lazy, and I realized, I can just kind of tuck the quilt here between the front rail and that 2nd rail, and everything kind of just generally sticks together real nicely, and I don't really think that you have to pin to that bottom rail. And then Grace Company actually came out with a really cool little product that can help you just bypass that whole step. And so these are quilt clips, and what this does is you get the quilt smoothed out just exactly like I've done. I smoothed out the batting, smoothed out the quilt top, got it all nice, ready to go, and then you just press these clips and then just give them a little rotate, and that puts nice tension on that quilt. So here, I'll press this one in place, just give it a little bit of a rotate, and here's the last one. Just slide that in place, give it a little rotate, and I just really like that. It adds a nice little bit of tension to the surface, really flattens out the quilt top nicely. And the best thing is, whenever I advance the quilt through the machine, it's much easier to sort everything out, smooth it all out, and get back to quilting. So I really like this setup. This is my favorite so far. But of course, if you have any questions about this process, please post in the comments below. I'm here to help you learn more about long arm quilting. And speaking of long arms, I am quilting on the Grace Cunique 14 Plus. It was recently renamed the 15R, and this is the 8-foot continuum frame, and I absolutely love this combination. It's so much fun to quilt and be able to move so much faster through a project. I really have been pleasantly surprised by how much faster long arm quilting is. I still love quilting on my home machine, I really, really do, but when I have a project I just want to knock it out fast, the long arm really is the way to go. Now, I am a dealer now for Grace Company, and you can find this exact setup, my frame and my machine, set up together in a package at leahday.com/frame. So I hope you'll come and check it out and learn more. And if you're interested at all in long arm quilting and this is something that you're curious about, please contact us for more information. I'm happy to film videos specifically for you. If you have something that you're curious about and you really want to learn more, please let me know. So check it out at leahday.com/frame. Until next time, let's go quilt.